thanks everyone for joining us this morning, this evening, this afternoon, wherever you are, on our 13th webinar. And today we're going to focus very much on the third consultation paper and an update in terms of where we're up to with the rest of the project. Before I begin though, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we are meeting today in Canberra, that is the Ngunnawal people. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So as I mentioned, we have 3 items today. So an update on the sandpit and some of the feedback we've had, where we're up to, some information about consultation paper 3 to give a bit more of the background and the focus areas, and then a time at the end for questions and answers, which, as Rachel mentioned, will be through our Slido tool. So please feel free to put those in as we progress. And now I'd like to hand over to Gary, please.
Thanks, Michelle, and hi everybody. So those of you who don't know me, I'm Gary Pascoe. I'm the sort of product owner for the UDI database, and have been asked to sort of talk a little bit about where we're at with Sandpit. Hopefully everybody's familiar and has used Sandpit to date. So just give you a little bit of an update on Sandpit, and as well as some of the other actions we've taken over the last couple of weeks since the last webinar. So as you can see in front of you there, we have 325 registrations, or sort of organisations, people, sponsors, manufacturers register their interest in Sandpit. So it's been a really high usage and a high number of people registered. So we had 325 registered. We're in the process of just finalising those in terms of the access, but as you can see, the bulk of people, so 316 of those, have been granted access and now having and using the database. We probably have a percentage of most of those who have access are representing manufacturers and sponsors. So about 75% of the access is coming from manufacturers and sponsors, and the other 30% then really is a sort of grouping between general public, those who are probably representing a manufacturer and sponsor, but also want to have a look at that and see what's happening from the a general public perspective, as well as some TGA staff and sort of other interested stakeholders from within the healthcare sector. So we've had really good sort of take up over the last couple of months. The numbers are slowing down. So if you are interested in using Sandpit and you haven't had access yet, please sort of get in touch with us through one of the links that's on this on the webinar, or if you haven't seen it, it's on the UDI hub within the TGA website. We have a number of records, so different users of testing the Sandpit, and really looking at it from a perspective of ensuring that the validations, the interpretation of the rules within the UDI domain are consistent with their understanding of UDI, but also just getting a general feel of the process and how the application generally works. So we've had some fantastic feedback coming back to date. As we mentioned there's been 190 calls that we've received. We've also made a number of calls out, and surveys with the support team have been spending a lot of time sort of talking to various users around making sure they get access and online. And then we've had about 307 emails. So we've had sort of really active and sort of interested feedback. So that's fantastic. Over the last couple of months, we've actually rolling out probably every 2 to 3 weeks updates to the Sandpit version. Those who are using it, we do make those publish those and announce those at a high level on the banner page. But really, we've made 4 major updates to fix errors and make some enhancements over the last couple of months. Largely, have been around making some usability and refinements. So there's a couple of small number of errors that have come up, and we've made some fixes to those, but largely it's around improving user support for sign up and the account creation, as well as then usability of the application. I know a number of you have had questions about when we first started around getting your accounts created, being able to ensure that you had access that you required. So we did make a few changes to make that simpler and a bit more intuitive. So thank you for your feedback in relation to that. And then that's now flowed through to making a number of usability enhancements around the validation rules for how the application validates between fields, but also then ensuring that it's clearer in terms of the messaging that's received. So That's been really helpful, and we've hopefully people will see some of the refinements and some of the usability improvements coming through. We have also made a number of changes and refinements to some of the back-end activities. So we'll talk a little bit more about the connection with the National Product Catalogue. So ensuring that we, as part of our testing through that, to ensure that we can put some validations in place to allow the connection with the National Product Catalogue, and that flows smoothly for manufacturers and sponsors who use the MPC as a method to have access. So there's been a number of things. We will continue to see changes coming through, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next moment. So Michelle, I'm happy to just sort of move on to the next slide. So what we have been doing, and then I'll sort of cover a little bit about sort of the update. So we do have machine-to-machine functions now up and running. So the machine-to-machine access is using a developer portal, which we presented to a number of different stakeholders who are interested in the machine-to-machine and using it as part of our technical working group that was covered last Thursday. And so machine-to-machine, we have had a small number of transactions come through via the machine-to-machine interface. So if you are interested in testing and trialing machine-to-machine, please let us know. Probably the greater interest to date, and largely that's because of the process that we have in place with GS1 Australia, is the use of the National Product Catalogue to have data flow through from the National Product Catalogue into the Australian UDI database. We have implemented, or we've been working with GS1 Australia to test and put in place a process for providing data through the National Product Catalogue into the UDI database. We've had a number of testing cycles with GS1 Australia to have that tested and confirmed. We did make a number of minor changes to make sure data mapping and everything was occurring, and we're in the process of actually working with a small set of manufacturers and sponsors now to actually test that through end to end. As we were talking, we've made the machine-to-machine changes. We're in the process of just finalising. We're starting some work around with a number of suppliers with the National Product Catalogue to test manufacturer and sponsor data running through end to end from their source system into the National Product Catalogue and then into the UDI database. We've decided to take a small set of manufacturers and sponsors to sort of test that in the first instance to make sure that we can validate it end to end and it works within with both their business and technical perspective, as well as obviously with the TGA's implementation of UDI, and that's commencing. And we've had a good session to sort of kick that off with those manufacturers and sponsors. So over coming weeks, I know we've had a number of organisations also express an interest in using the MPC as the means for exchanging data into the UDI database. So we are working very closely with GS1 Australia, and we ask that you sort of coordinate that in the first instance with GS1 Australia and ensure that they're in a place to be able to sort of help that flow through. But it's looking very positive, and we've had really good interest and outcomes. It will likely to cater for a large number of volumes of data coming through, which is pleasing. The final thing is that we looking at, we've had probably the area of the most feedback is really around the Excel bulk file upload and the functionality that we had implemented in the sandpit. And we've had extensive feedback, both in terms of saying what's working well, as well as areas that you would like improved. And we've taken a lot of that feedback. And those of you who attended the technical working group session last week, we've sort of presented some ideas and concepts to how we would like to implement that, and moving to a more streamlined process that would better suit what feedback we received from the manufacturers and sponsors, and particularly looking at creating having bulk files or multiple records in a single file rather than the current approach, which is requesting multiple files for each UDI record. So that's sort of working through, and we're looking to in the coming weeks of making updates. We'll be sharing those updates within the sandpit users, as well as then sort of seeking your feedback on that and looking to refine it over the coming weeks. So just to sort of in final, we are looking to also use that information through to the early adopter work. So those that are sending us data and have agreed to publish it or looking to publish, then that device information is starting to be considered and looked at by healthcare institutions, organisation, hospitals, registries, etc., to be able to then use that and see how that would then flow through and the implications of UDI from their sort of downstream use of UDI in their systems. But we certainly would like to encourage everybody to keep giving us feedback. We have received a lot to date. However, it is something that we, Sandpit will be continue to run right up until the voluntary compliance. So we are looking to use it as a means to ensure that we get your feedback. Which is a nice segue then into really then one of the mechanisms that we're using to establish feedback is our technical working groups. Those who have participated in webinars before or sort of been involved with the project from the UDI and the TGA's perspective for the first half of the year and before Sandpit went live, we had a number of technical working groups that we ran to elicit and solicit feedback from you around the usability of the application, the end-to-end implementation, and any sort of technical issues that you may have in relation to use of the UDI database. We have reinstated those working groups, and first meeting, or a kick-off meeting, was held last Thursday on the 15th of September, and we'll be moving into a fortnightly cycle starting the 4th of October. So there's been a slight variation to the technical working group. So rather than meeting weekly, we will now work on a fortnightly cycle, which as part of the feedback from the stakeholders was that they would like to have a bit of a longer period of time to consult with various stakeholders within their organisations to give us feedback, and so we've moved to a fortnightly cycle as well as extending the time frame slightly so that we can the group can have more time to work through and talk through the specific issues. So if you haven't received an invite to those technical working groups and you'd like to participate, the UDI mailbox email address is down there on that page, udi@health.gov.au. Please feel free to send your name, role and organisation to us, and we'll make sure that we include you in the invitation list. Anybody who has participated in the technical working groups to date, you should be receiving an invite already. So if you haven't received that, please also send an email to udi@health.gov.au. So that's sort of pretty well my sort of updates. I assume we can take some questions if you do have any that we can take at the end of the session as part of the questions and answer session. And I will hand over to Michelle to continue with the agenda.
Thank you so much, Gary. We're up to now an area that we're going to talk through in terms of the consultation paper. So really in early February 2021, we made the changes to the Therapeutic Goods Act part that were passed by Parliament, and they are now in force. And what that means is that we have approval for the TGA to collect the data and establish the database. And so what we need to do now is to operationalise all of the requirements in the medical devices regulation. So that's the process we're going through now. The Australian government will decide on the regulatory changes and make the regulations. So it's not something the TGA does, but what we do is we'll seek detailed feedback to inform the government's decision. And that's the purpose of this third paper. So we've tried to put a proposed regulatory framework in the paper with some questions on particular focus areas. And obviously it's open to other responses and feedback, which we'd really appreciate. So we're seeking input across a broad range of stakeholders. So obviously manufacturers and sponsors from a perspective of data suppliers and labelling of the devices and supply of the devices into Australia, but also then from the users of the data. So hospitals, healthcare professionals, clinical quality registries, and so on, because we want to make sure as much as we can that the data is usable and that we've taken the use of the data into consideration as much as the provision of it, including the labelling and so on. So in parallel, we're doing our consultation with the Sandpit, so the ability to give us feedback on the technical aspects, and the early adopter work to try and get some early feedback on its use or potential use in hospitals and other systems. So we're doing all of those in parallel at the moment. So really, consultation paper 3 follows on from our first two consultations and the information that we've obtained through working groups and other feedback and forums to look at the detailed considerations now for the framework. And that includes feedback on the impact of accepting both European and USA compliant labels. So Australia is a small percentage of the market, and we would anticipate that a lot of the devices here are also supplied into Europe and the USA, who have UDI requirements already in place. So how can we minimise the burden and take those European and USA labels, and what does that mean for users of the labels and the data as well? On the second consultation paper, we got feedback around trying to accelerate the full benefits through UDI in Australia. So we're looking at what that looks like, what does the implementation plan look like, and how do we phase that in line with what other regulators have done. We're looking at the scope and exemptions in applying the UDI. So under what circumstances is a UDI mandatory? When is it voluntary, and when devices exempt, for example? Providing and maintaining data over the full life of the device. So we've heard around how that data might change over the life of the device. There might be a requirement for a new device identifier as part of a trigger. So if there's a merger or acquisition, for example, and how do we manage that in our database? And then how do users use that data? What might fees and charges look like for UDI going forward? Because this is new to the TGA, from the 1st of July, it will need to be incorporated in our fees and charges. So what might that look like, and what might need to be taken into consideration? And then challenges around labelling and supporting documentation. So what should we have in place around those? We're interested in feedback on potential regulatory burden, which we are really attempting to minimise as much as we can, but appreciate feedback in that area. And then some feedback on adoption and use in the broader healthcare setting. And really what we've tried to do in the paper is write the intent. So plain English, purpose, what are we trying to achieve? And then we haven't put proposed text for future regulations, because the regulations will be determined by the government and we don't yet have those. I just wanted to come back to this point. So we've really put some underpinning principles together to show the key considerations in Australia. And the first one is patient safety first. So, you know, the purpose of being able to track and trace who has a medical device implanted, where there might be issues with that device going forward, including in 10 or 20 years' time. But the other 5 underpinning principles are alignment with the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, who's published 2 papers, a UDI guidance and an application guide. So at a high level, in principle, alignment with all of those. We need to consider the users, so I mentioned that before. So how do we accelerate adoption and use in clinical and hospital settings, and make it easy for those organisations to use the UDI in their systems? We'll make core UDI data accessible to the public, and that will be free of charge. And so that will be available to anybody, and they won't have to log in specifically to access that data or to download it. We want to minimise the burden on manufacturers wherever feasible. So we note that many manufacturers are having to comply with UDI regulations across many countries, and in some cases those are different, or the underpinning regulatory framework might be different as well. And the UDI data held by the regulator should be current, correct, easy to access and maintain, and that talks about data validation, maximise usage and value without having to rework the data, and things like agreed drop-down lists and minimising free text fields. In terms of international alignment, this has been a focus all the way through in terms of where Australia needs to align. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we'll align with the IMDRF framework, and we're proposing that we accept UDI labelling that complies with either USA or the EU requirements. And we understand from conversations and feedback that a number of manufacturers are already working towards a universal device label for this purpose to aid in multiple markets. And we know some of them are also creating a core set of UDI data and then augmenting that with country-specific requirements to assist in management and providing UDI data to multiple countries. So we're seeking feedback on how that proposal works for data providers and users, and also with the data elements, should the TGA accept and store USA and EU compliant data in addition to the labels, and that would lend itself to potentially different date formats or different metrics. And so there's some areas around there we need to explore further, and we would really invite feedback on. It's worth noting that in Australia, we already have a UDI regulatory system, and we need to align with our existing framework. There's no proposal to change how our existing framework works. We'll need to feed UDI into it. And so what we're proposing, obviously subject to government decisions, is to amend the medical device regulations to establish the database, require the inclusion of UDIs and related information in the database, and we're proposing that that's likely to be as part of the essential principles and include related requirements in the essential principles, including labelling, for example. In Australia, the sponsor is principally responsible for ensuring the regulatory requirements are met for devices in Australia. And we know this adds complexity when a labeller might undertake some activities on a sponsor's behalf, such as attaching a label to a device. So we've heard that in most cases the labeller will be the sponsor or the manufacturer, but in some instances it may be a specialist third party acting on behalf of the sponsor or the manufacturer. We need to define what the proposed scope of devices is, and so what we're proposing in the paper and requesting feedback on is proposing that most kinds of medical devices would be required to comply with the UDI requirements, unless we identify in the essential principles as kinds of devices for which a UDI is not required. So we have some Australian areas we are proposing to be in scope, for example, medical devices in the Australian emergency stockpile, medical devices exempt from inclusion in the ARTG but that are regulated, and replacement parts where the original part was in scope. Class 1 devices we know is a challenge more broadly than just Australia. And so we really appreciate some feedback in this area. Generally, the Class 1 devices are low risk, high volume. And so there's an administrative overhead in providing the data, for example, for contact lenses or glass frames, etc. And some of those we regulate in the same way as other countries and others we don't. But globally, it's been recognised there are specific challenges in requiring UDIs for Class 1 devices, which are generally those lower risk devices. And we know that the US, for example, has recently released guidance relating to Class 1 devices that in the US are defined as non-life supporting or non-life sustaining. And they've made some changes to compliance dates and requirements, particularly those consumer health products, which are more of those that are for home use and supplied over the counter. Other considerations for Class 1 devices might be around confusion for consumers if some devices are in the Australian UDI database and others are not. Some Class 1 devices are both consumer health products and used in hospitals, such as specimen containers. And what might the impact be on hospitals if there are some devices that have UDIs and others that don't, in terms of inventory management, auto scanning? Will that be an additional burden on those hospitals? And then the other consideration is, should the TGA consider some kind of grouping mechanism to reduce the number of UDI records that might be required? And that's from a perspective of an administrative overhead rather than a technical capacity perspective. In the paper, we are seeking feedback on some proposed exemptions, and we have a list of those, so including Class 1 general laboratory IVD medical devices such as pipettes, medical devices that are surgical loan kits, and that's at the kit level rather than the individual device level. Medical devices and IVD medical devices imported into and supplied in Australia under specific schemes such as the Special Access Scheme or the Authorised Prescriber Scheme or any of the other exemption pathways. Exporter-only medical devices and IVDs, because they will be exported to a country that may have different UDI requirements from Australia. Individual single-use disposable devices contained within a system or procedure pack, which are not intended for individual use outside the context of that system or procedure pack. Devices that are exempted from bearing a UDI carrier, so the UDI information on the relevant level of packaging when included within a system or procedure pack, custom-made medical devices, and in-house IVDs. We are proposing a phased implementation, so we're seeking feedback on the timing for this implementation. And some of the considerations include the US finalising its implementation, but also the EU dates in terms of UDIMED particularly, and the database being ready for the provision of data. So even though some of the EU data compliance dates are in force around assigning, applying a UDI and labelling, the provision of data to UDIMED is not yet in force because the database isn't publicly available for use for compliance yet. So we've taken the same approach that other countries have in terms of a phased implementation, really focusing on high-risk devices first, and then moving through the device categories in a staged way. So in this case, we've looked at 2-year periods around the stages, and similarly for IVD. And we understand that there are direct marking, the processes need to be put in place for direct marking of devices that may not have required that before. So some of those dates are also a little bit later for mandatory compliance around direct marking, to really acknowledge the amount of effort that might have to go in to put those UDIs directly on those devices themselves. So we really appreciate feedback on the compliance dates we're proposing here and the phasing, whether we can potentially go faster for, again, to accelerate the full patient safety benefits. But obviously we need to balance that against the additional requirements now and the additional work that manufacturers and sponsors will need to do to be compliant. The consultation is open on the TGA Consultation Hub, and so you'll be able to search by unique or UDI, and you'll be able to find the UDI Consultation Paper there. So I've shown you the screen. If you haven't used it before, you just need to search for UDI in there. We would like feedback through the online survey if possible, because that makes the consolidation easier. But if that's not possible or feasible, it's possible to download copies of the paper and provide feedback separately to what's in the hub. The consultation was published on the 31st of August and will be open till the 11th of October. So we still have a number of weeks left around to provide data. And if you need any assistance, please let us know through our udi@health.gov.au. And just a final note that the survey is an online survey, so you can use that to then type in answers to questions. And the last question really is providing any other feedback. So if there's anything that we haven't asked or you think perhaps we haven't considered and should, there is actually a general response question at the end that you can provide that feedback on. So here you can see we have attached the consultation paper, previous consultation papers, and a cover sheet and information around using the hub. So hopefully that's covered everything there, but if there's additional questions, please don't hesitate to let us know. And just a reminder, the government will decide on the regulatory changes and make the decisions and the regulations, and so the feedback is really to inform the government's decision. The regulations will need to be in place before voluntary compliance. So in order to then have voluntary compliance, we need the regulations in place, and then the final version of an Australian UDI database, which is now in the sandpit. So that's why we're seeking feedback in parallel. So I'll take a breath there. So hopefully that's given everyone a background onto the paper. And if you haven't already, then you can go ahead and do the survey and download the paper. So we'll stop briefly for the poll question. So I'll hand over to Rachel, and then we will come back just in a few minutes, and we've got probably a good 20 minutes now for questions and answers. So please put those in Slido, and we'll read them from there, and then answer the ones that we can. If there's any we have to take on notice, then we'll do that as well and make sure we provide an answer at the next webinar. I'm seeing quite a lot of questions come through, some relating to the consultation and some relating to the technical side. So some of them are being voted up. So I will, what I might do is start with some of the technical questions, Gary, and hand those to you, and then I'll answer some of the consultation questions. So first question, Gary, if you are okay with that, is any updates on the machine-to-machine method?
Michelle, yes, no, and yes. So we actually have you demonstrated the connection to the machine-to-machine. So anybody who would look to access it via machine-to-machine, we have developed a developer gateway and developer portal for those which will provide secret keys, tokens, etc. for anybody looking to access the machine-to-machine updates. So if you haven't sort of received any of that, please let us know. We have demonstrated that with the technical working group last week and actually recorded that session. So for those who are interested in accessing the developer portal, we're in the process of just finalising sort of video from that so that we can get that out to the group. And if anybody's interested, we'll just use that to run through the video. So there's not so really any major changes or updates, but it is something that we have had a few people ask us how to access the developer portal. So we sort of recorded that as part of the technical working group. So we'll get that out to those who sort of have registered for TWGs as well as webinars.
Great, thank you. And the next question, also a technical one to you, Gary, is when will the new Excel template for bulk upload be available for testing?
It's a very good question. So we're actually working through that at the moment. We are looking to have a version of that out to groups just to have a look at from the Excel spreadsheet perspective. So we've made a number of usability improvements as well as then just sort of change the paradigm or change the approach and how the spreadsheet works. So our aim is within the next couple of weeks to have that out. If it doesn't happen within that period of time, we will be sort of pretty disappointed. So we're just making sure and testing that, make sure it's right. We want to get it as sort of close as a good state as possible in the next couple of weeks, and then we'll issue that out through the sandpit version. And once we've done that, then we'll sort of take feedback and any comments and make ongoing refinements. But I expect it to be soon.
Fantastic, thank you. And another technical one for you. Has the TGA developed a list of country-specific attribute fields for Australia, i.e. regional specific data set not captured by EU or US?
It's a good question. It's probably sort of technical as well as then sort of the regulatory side of things. So we have obviously identified what the Australian specific data elements are. We are looking to obviously have received feedback through the consultation paper in terms of other elements, and we'll refine that list once that's all happened, and obviously the recommendations from government that Michelle sort of talked a bit about. We don't have anything that publishes where the differences are within the Australian side of things, but it is certainly something that we're looking to have a revision to the data dictionary to reflect that. So our current data dictionary does sort of highlight those fields, but it is something that we will just sort of ongoing develop until after the regulations are finalised.
Thanks, Gary. And I think that's good feedback to know. One of the things we're looking at doing is developing all of the supporting documentation. So we understand some of the regulators have done this particularly well. So we're looking at what we need to publish and perhaps that's something we can consider when we put that information together as that very specific Australian list, in addition to the data dictionary that you mentioned. I might take some of the regulatory questions now. Some of them, we've had a couple relating to the time frame. So really, what is the time frame in Australia, and when will the government decision be made? And so really, we are working towards a voluntary compliance date of 1st of January 2023, and our first mandatory compliant date on the 1st of July 2024. And so the government regulations will need to be in place for the voluntary compliance. So that's the date we're working towards, both from a regulatory perspective and then from a technical perspective. And we understand there's time to, once those regulations are finalised, for particularly manufacturers and sponsors to prepare for the new regulations. And so that's why the first mandatory compliance date is 1st of July 2024, to give sufficient time to prepare. So that's an 18 months from the regs to the 1st of July. And obviously there might be some manufacturers or sponsors who might be already ahead of that because they're already supplying into the EU or the US or both, and therefore it's not a significant impact in terms of the work they need to undertake. And so that's why we've got this early voluntary compliance, again, to try and accelerate the patient safety benefits, the full benefits. I've got a question on the software, which has got the most votes. So regarding the proposed software UDI requirement, that the UDI would be searchable on the manufacturer's website, just trying to understand the purpose of this. So what's the intent behind the requirement? And so I'm just, we'll take that one on notice in terms of the detail behind it, but the intent around the software that is proposed in the paper is really to align with what the US already has in place. And so if we need to then decompose that and look at individual areas in that, please provide that feedback back in the paper. But really, we are proposing that we are aligned more closely with the US on that. I think when the IMDRF did some of the work, that a lot of these areas were emerging, and so therefore they might not be covered at the same level of detail by the IMDRF, but as the US has been running for a number of years, then that's why we've proposed in this case that it might be appropriate to align with the US. I have another question with 7 votes. Can you kindly elaborate further on the first question in the consultation? We do not understand what TGA means by saying, should we accept both US and EU compliant labels? Are you referring specifically to units of measure, etc.? So yes, what we're proposing there are US and EU compliant labels with the UDI data. So if there are differences between the US and the EU in terms of the UDI requirements, in terms of the labelling, so there might be some differences where a whole UDI doesn't fit on a particular label, for example, around which part, whether it's the human readable part or the machine readable, the scannable part, that needs to be on there. So what we're saying is if those are different across the US and the EU, we are proposing that we accept both of those. And the issue there, or the challenge there, and the reason we're seeking feedback on that is because we want to understand if that has an impact on the users. So we understand that we're proposing it because we think it will be easier on manufacturers and sponsors and reduce the burden. But we want to hear particularly from the users and anyone who's actually needs to look at those labels and the UDI component of those labels to really see whether it's going to make it more difficult for them, or where there might be some things we need to consider as part of that work. So hopefully I've answered that question. We've got one which is, how comparable are the Australian UDI requirements to UDIMED EU IVDR for alignment and adoption? So right now we don't have a document that defines the differences and the similarities across Australia and the EU. And we know that we already have some regulatory differences for IVDs in Australia, and so we're not proposing we move away from our existing regulatory framework. So the UDI will be in addition to our regulatory framework, which is already in place. Can the recording for this webinar be released to the public earlier? We'd like to share the advice with overseas manufacturers prior to the consultation closing. So we will do our absolute best to have this webinar up and quickly available to enable that to occur. So the answer is we'll do our best, and hopefully we'll be able to do that. I've got a question around procedure packs which contain a medicine and a device, so those combinations where they're both, where the primary mode of action is the medicine. And the question is, will this be exempt from UDI requirements, as is in the case in the US and EU? And in these markets, co-packaged drug and device combination product packaging does not need to contain UDI information. So I'm not sure we've covered that particularly definitely in the proposal, but the proposal would be yes, they would be excluded because they're then regulated as a medicine, not as a device. But we will have a look at that and see if we need to provide some more clarity or any further questions around that one. So we'll add that to our list of things to cover. Is there a character limit on the UDI response portal for each question? That is a really good question. And the answer is there is a total maximum limit. I'm actually not quite sure what that is, so apologies but I think it's around 500 characters. And so if you see some of the responses have a single line where we've thought they're likely to be shorter, some have multiple lines and sort of larger space, effectively they are the same. You can have the same maximum characters. But if you're finding that that is too difficult in your response, can you please let us know? Because we can make some adjustments in the consultation portal to accommodate that if particular answers, for example, are proving to be a little bit difficult for one line, because then you have to keep scrolling through the line. So thank you for that question on the paper. Another one that we've received, can you explain further on question 1 of the paper? So if the ARTG has approved the labels, should the database accept them? So I'm not quite sure what that means, but really the ARTG is our Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, which has a listing of all approved or authorised devices that can be supplied to the Australian market. And so what we are doing is mandatory compliance when it comes into effect will mean that every model of device on the ARTG will be required to have a mandatory UDI label and meet the mandatory requirements unless it's one of the devices which are exempt from the UDI requirements. So hopefully I understood that question correctly. If not, please write in again. I might take some technical questions now, Gary, and I will hand those over to you. They're now being voted to the top of the list.
Yeah.
What level of data transfer is being tested from the National Product Catalogue database? So if you're overseas, the Australian National Product Catalogue is the equivalent of the Global Data Synchronisation Network and other data pools, but it's a very Australian specific one. So the question is, what level of data transfer is being tested from the NPC? All the fields or only mandatory fields? That is, how will the ARTG be linked if we opt for NPC data upload? So Gary, that one's over.
Sure, Michelle. So 2 parts. So the first part of the question was what level of data transfer is being tested. So we are testing all fields. Obviously, all fields. The NPC will have a range of other data attributes and data elements that aren't relevant to UDI. We don't transfer those over, but anything that's coming from the NPC that relates to the Australian UDI record, both mandatory and optional, we are testing and have tested and mapped all those into the UDI database. So there are obviously there'll be different levels of validation. So if you don't send us a mandatory field, we'll obviously send back a message saying, we can't process a record because mandatory fields are missing. So there's elements of different levels of validation with mandatory and option fields. And so hopefully that answers the question. Including in one of those data elements, the NPC does cater for the provision of the ARTG ID as part of that data transfer. And so those of you or those organisations that do use the NPC that does have the ARTG ID associated with the UDI record coming from the NPC, then we will load that into the UDI record and associate that with the ARTG entry. Essentially, that will happen as a sort of part of the process. Those organisations or those sponsors and manufacturers who don't have the ARTG ID, we're still working through in terms of what that process would be and how that could be. We have a range of options from using the online portal, as well as having a bulk spreadsheet that you can provide that linkage yourself and upload if you have a large number of records in it. An online record by record entry is too difficult. So we're working through that, but certainly the NPC data transfer allows for ARTG to come through. Hopefully that's covered everything.
Thanks, Gary. Another technical question for you. Will there be an export? I'm handing over to the expert to answer the export question. Will there be an export function in the final Oz UDID?
Yes. So we have the we're sort of effectively mirroring, and we have an export function in the sandpit now. So it'll export into a JSON or machine readable file. We're effectively mirroring the fairly standard practice for within the sort of medical device and other regulators. So you can export a full download of the database. You can search certain fields and filter out and then export those fields, or sorry, those records. Alternatively, we also have a sort of a daily, monthly, weekly update. So any records that were changed in the last week, we will be able to have that capability to download those as well. At the moment in Sandpit, we just have the full download, and we're in the process of just finalising the sort of the weekly, monthly, daily process. But that will definitely happen once we voluntary compliance goes live.
Thank you so much, Gary. We've got some more detailed questions that what we might do is hold some of those over. So we've got one, which is why do class 2A and 2B devices have a combined implementation date when the risk profile is very different? So appreciate any feedback you have in the paper around that, noting that, that risk profile is important. We've also had one which I will read out and then we might take on notice. So for reclassification products where they won't be up-classified and the manufacturer will stop production by 2024, November, will these also need to comply with UDI implementation by July 2024? So that will essentially mean devices that enter Australia between July and November 2024. So it will be a requirement if they meet the first mandatory compliance date, but we'll look into that further as well, because that's one of the complexities between the other work that's going on around reclassification of devices and EU alignment and the UDI work. So we'll take that one on notice and have a look at that as well. We have a question on how is TGA managing to align the local IVD GMDN collective terms with the global IVD GMDN codes? So it's a good question, and it's something we will seek feedback on in the consultation. So we're proposing some more changes around how we use the global medical device nomenclature going forward in relation to UDI, because it will be at the model of device level and also model of device level for IVDs. And so we're looking at some changes around that in terms of how we align those in both keeping the code current potentially and also how we have IVDs and how they use the collective terms. So I appreciate your feedback on those as part of the consultation. We just have 2 questions. So for anyone, if you haven't already asked a question or we haven't answered anything, we will take the rest of these on notice. So I will answer one more, which we can do in the time frame, and then we'll make a note of the rest. But if you've got others that we haven't answered or that really occur to you after the webinar, please feel free to send them through to us at udi@health.gov.au. So two, I think, quick ones that we can answer. Will implementation dates shift if UDIMED dates shift? And so that's a really, really good question, and appreciate your feedback in the consultation as whether they should. So if the EU dates move, should the TGA move its dates, its proposed dates or its actual dates, depending on the time frame, to align with the EU date? So appreciate feedback on there. The other one we've got, which there's a bit of a question around, is can the EU UDI database be used in mass upload to the Oz UDID database? And that's something we can look at. Obviously, then we'll be highly dependent on the EU dates around the provision of data if we use that as a source. But definitely, if there are things that we could consider around either the US Good ID or the EU system in terms of loading data that is somehow then approved or modified as needed, appreciate that feedback as part of the consultation or as part of the technical working group if there's some technical considerations there. So I see we're right on time, and I'd really like to thank everyone. They're really great questions. We'll get to the rest of them, and really reach out to us, please, if you need anything else between now and particularly the October close date for the consultation paper. I think just finally, before I wrap up, we really wanted to just reach out and thank everyone for the tremendous input, support, feedback, for everyone who's logged into the sandpit, for everyone who's joined one of our groups or provided feedback through other forums. It's really important that we get this feedback, and we really appreciate the openness and the ability to really share that with us. It helps inform the government decisions and our design of the technical database as well. So just wanted to say thank you, particularly because for some of us in Australia, that's really easy to manage, but I know a number are dialing in from overseas at crazy hours or in scrubs from hospitals, and we do really appreciate the support and the input. So thanks everyone for joining. We'll get this up on the website as quickly as we possibly can, noting the close date and the ability to share it, and we'll try and provide some other answers as well. So thank you so much. We'll see you third Tuesday in October. Thank you.